Good morning to one and all present over here in the virtual platform. It gives me immense pleasure in welcoming all of you to online 5-day FDP on Global Perspectives in Literature and World Cinema, organized by Amity School of Languages, Amity University, Chhattisgarh. This is the third day of the FDP, and I, Dr. Shubhankar Roy, working in the capacity of an assistant professor at Amity School of Languages, is convinced that the program will be churning out to be thought-provoking sessions with the spontaneous participation of the researchers and academicians across India. I am reminded of Andre Baja, a French theorist on cinema, who argued that cinema was an intrinsically realist medium on two grounds, ontological and phenomenological, and the intrinsic interrelationship between the two is indicative of the importance of the theme. Today, we have with us a galaxy of speakers who will ignite the audience with their insightful deliberations. At the outset, we are privileged to have Professor Ujjwal Jana, who will shed light on the topic disability in literature and films, and may I have the honor to introduce him to the audience. Dr. Ujjwal Jana is professor in the Department of English, Faculty of Arts, University of Delhi. His areas of interest are Indian poetics, literary studies, translation studies, and digital humanities. He has published several research papers in peer-reviewed national and international journals. He is the co-editor of Green Symphony, Studies in Eco-Criticism, Ecological Criticism for Our Times, Literature, Nature, and Critical Inquiry, and Subaltern Vision, a study in post-colonial Indian English novel. He was a Fulbright visiting lecturer, India Studies Program, Indiana University, Bloomington, USA in 2007 to 2008. He was nominated for Commonwealth Academic Staff Fellowship in UK for the year 2013. He has been awarded the Sahitya Academy Travel Grants Award in 2014. He was visiting faculty in Department of English, Leipzig University in 2014, sponsored by ICSSR and DFG. He was a visiting faculty in the Department of English, University of Johannesburg, South Africa, sponsored by ICSSR, India, and NIHSS, South Africa in 2017. He has been awarded with the MHRD Government of India funded international collaborative project in digital humanities in Indian Dream under SPARC to collaborate with Western Sydney University, Australia for 2019 to 2021. He was selected for Faculty Mobility Award sponsored by Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute and Ministry of Human Resource Development for 2020 to 2021. Dr. Jana was awarded with Hungarian State Scholarship in the academic year 2021 to 2022, funded by Tempus Foundation of Government of Hungary to pursue collaborative research project in the Institute of English and American Studies, Debrecen University, Hungary, from June 2022 to July 2022. Dr. Jana's Bengali translation of Amit Chaudhry's Sahitya Academy award-winning English novel A New World by the Sahitya Academy, India's National Academy of Letters, has been published in 2021. Dr. Jana has been awarded a Hungarian State Scholarship for 2022 to 2023, funded by Tempus Foundation of the Government of Hungary to carry out a collaborative research at the ELTE Department of English Studies, Eötvös Loránd University, Budapest, Hungary. Professor Jana has edited an anthology on digital culture in humanities, contemporary trends, published by ABS Books, a Delhi-based publishing house in January 2022. So I welcome you, Professor Jana, sir, and the platform is yours.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction, and I'm extremely privileged to be a part of this FDP program. And I sincerely thank the Department of English, particularly the head of the department and the organizer of the FDP program for having me here. And as I know that I am already late, so let me come into the business. So today I'm going to share my thoughts on disability representation in literature and in film. As I have only 1 hour time at my disposal, so what I am going to do basically is that I'm going to talk about a couple of things. So initially I'm going to talk about the representation of disability in literature and film. And then I'm going to briefly talk about the history of disability and the different models which are associated with the emergence of the literary and cultural discourse of disability. And in the final part of my presentation, I'm going to focus on representation of disability in literary texts both from India and from abroad, and then briefly on a couple of films, in particular from Bollywood and from regional films. Now, let me put it this way. When we think of disability literary studies, immediately we are reminded of many of the critical humanities studies which are emerging in the contemporary times. We can think of environmental humanities, we can think of medical humanities, we can think of gender studies, we can think of refugee studies, and many more. Now, question is that, is it that disability studies, or in particularly critical disability studies or disability literary studies, has not been there in our literary and cultural tradition? Now, I would like to argue here is that the rise of disability literary studies as a critical field of investigation is a recent one, particularly from the 1990s. Now, but disability as an idea, disability as a concept, it has been in existence in all civilizations of the world, spanning across time and space. Disability is everywhere. Disability is in every place, and disability is, as I have already mentioned, disability is omnipresent, and it is also like it has its omniscient presence also. Now, our idea of disability has been, our idea means, when we think of the non-Western representation of disability or non-Western discourse of disability, it has been mostly been influenced by our understanding of the Euro-American idea of disability, and also many of the insights that we are using in the contemporary context, they are all coming from the Western academia. Now, as I have already mentioned, that disability literary representation as a critical concept is very new, but the genesis of this particular discipline can be traced back in the ongoing social, cultural, political, and the economic movements, both in UK and in USA. As you all know, that disability literary studies as a critical discipline has much compatibilities with many of the contemporary fields of studies, which I have already mentioned. Disability studies in particularly is highly indebted to the activism or activist movements and identity-based movements, both in the UK and in USA. And based on those movements, I must say, activist movements, right-based movements, identity-based movements, from the 1970s and 1980s, we have had many of the kind of right-based movements for equal justice, for liberty, and for securing many more many more demands which people from disability background have been claiming for. And as you all know, in course of time, many of their movements, which are basically right-based movements, have proved to be very successful in the form of legislation of many of the kind of laws which favor people with disabilities. Now I would like to focus on the the critical part of this movement. The 1970s and the 1980s, as I have already mentioned, the movement which started in UK first and then it spread over to US. Both the movements happening in two different kind of spaces had their own characteristic nature. Whereas the movement in UK was more Marxist in nature, more sociological in nature. The movement in US, which started almost 10 years after UK, was mostly humanistic in nature. So the Marxist model of, or the sociological model of disability movements which started in UK looked at disability from the negative perspective. And accordingly, disablement is what turns an impairment into a body, into a bad and disabling thing. Whereas in the US, from the 1980s onward, the disability rights movement was basically an impact of the civil rights movement. We all know that disability rights movement in the US had mostly been impacted by the civil rights movement, Afro-American movement, and many other movements which had been taking place at that point of time. So disability right movements, I must say, received tremendous impetus and inspiration from the existing movements, the existing demonstrations, which had already been there in both in UK and in USA also. Gradually, we get to know that the sociological model which had been followed by the UK disability rights activists, it paved the way for kind of a humanistic model which had been taken over by the US model of disability movement. And ultimately what happened? So in course of time, these two different models, I must say, two different approaches to disability right movements merged together, and it had given rise to what is called disability studies, critical disability studies, or maybe we can put it this way, the cultural representation of disability. Now let me briefly touch upon the the disability models, because in order to understand disability literary representation, we need to know the existing models which had been in operation as far as disability studies are concerned. The most and in this context, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that disability, though it is new, I mean, the intervention of disability studies within the literary discipline may be new, but its existence or its presence in the field of sociology, in the field of medical sciences are not new, because the existence of the disabled people, their problems, their challenges, and kind of meaningful solution to their problems have been operational since time immemorial. Because all ancient civilizations of the world, they had the problem of, or maybe they had encounters with the disabled people, the challenges they had faced, the problems, the crises they had experienced in their life. So disability, I must say, has been a integral part of human experience and human existence. So the early model of disability that we have in the history of disability is called the charity model of disability. So briefly, I'll talk about that. So the charity model of disability is one of the earliest models of disability which had been kind of promoted by the religious organizations maybe, you know, in the early part of civilization. And we all know this charity model of disability basically tries to kind of argue that disability or disability person is worthy of charity, alms, and something like that. And all the religious organizations, be it church, be it temple, be it synagogue, they had created many of the charitable organizations like hospitals, you know, schools, which might care for the deaf and the dumb and the visually challenged. So in this charity model, you know, charity model, disability was considered to be a consequence of the action of the individual of the earlier birth. That means disability was considered to be a kind of sin because of the misdeeds in the past life. And so when somebody is born as a disabled or visually challenged or physically impaired, it is generally assumed that so this particular birth or this, you know, being born with disability is a kind of redemption of the to redeem the, you know, sins of the previous birth. And as you all know that many people saw that disability as a kind of test by God to give suffering and insight to the person and those around him or her. So disability was basically related to sin, prayer. So this is the, you know, religious interpretation of the disability, which have been you know, kind of practiced across globe, including in India. Then what happened? Then this disability model, this charity model of disability, you know, gave birth to you know, the medical model of disability. And till 1960, this medical model of disability had been one of the predominant features. So according to the medical model of disability, the impairment or the body is the site for the primary cause of disability. So medical model of disability basically tries to look at the body or the impairment in the body as the sole cause of disability. And it believes in the fact that through medical interventions, through caregiving services, the individual with, you know, bodily impairment or to some extent the mental impairment could be cured or could be remedied. So doctors, nurses, therapists, you know, they are all engaged to provide services and to, you know, kind of give, I must say, to give proper kind of treatment to the individual with an impaired body, And so, so this is basically, you know, there are many other, you know, contexts and ideas related to the medical model, but because of the paucity of time, I'm not going to discuss each and everything. Now, what happened? This medical model, which had been prevalent till 1960, it suffered from many of the shortcomings because medical model of disability, you know, kind of was one-sided, and it was trying to look at only the individual with the individual problem or individual crisis in the form of the deformity or the impairment. It didn't take into consideration or it did not acknowledge the role of the society, you know. So now what happened? So the limitations of this particular model basically, you know, paved the way for the social model of disability. Now, as we get the social model of disability, we get the idea that an individual can be born disabled, can be born as a disabled individual, or can, you know, or can become disabled in later part of the life. So that means disability can be hereditary or biological, and it can be acquired also, because somebody can born, somebody is born as a, you know, normal, you know, quote unquote, a normal human being, but in later part of life, because of some accident, because of some issue, because of some medical problem, one becomes, you know, disabled. Somebody can suffer from dyslexia, somebody can become, lame, somebody can lose one's own eye because of some accident. So now, so the social model of disability basically is of the fact that it is the society. It is the society. I'm repeating it again. It is the society which makes a disabled individual more disabled. What does that mean? It means that the inhospitable ambience or circumstances, the society is itself inimical to the growth and development of a disabled individual. The society must create a barrier-free, obstacle-free environment to a disabled individual for him to make a full participation in life. The problem of the medical model of disability, as I have already mentioned, which paved the way for the social model of disability, that they never tried to underline the potential of a disabled individual, that a disabled individual who is otherwise physically challenged have the full potential to perform like a quote unquote normal human being. I'm using the word normal within quote unquote, like a normal human being, like a able quote unquote able-bodied human being. They can achieve excellence in each and every sphere of life. They can perform at their level best. They can be achiever of their goals. But the question is, the inhospitable circumstances of the society do not provide the right kind of ambience, to the social model of disability. It was little bit of holistic or inclusive in nature. And because of the social model of disability, as I have already mentioned, the social model of disability had been spearheaded in the UK, and Michael Oliver, Tom Shakespeare, and many other had kind of promoted this social model of disability. The society must, what do we mean by society? Society includes different kind of institutions. Society is an institution, state is an institution. So all the social institutions must strive together to provide a better ambience, obstacle-free ambience. That means there should be a proper right kind of accommodation for the disabled people. There should be a good public transport system for the disabled. There must be provisions for reservation for the disabled people in jobs, in educational sectors, and many others. So if a disabled individual gets the right kind of ambience in terms of logistics, in terms of education, in terms of transport, in terms of other infrastructural facilities, he or she can make a full participation in life, thereby exercising the full potential that is hidden in him or her. Now what happened in course of time, this medical model of disability, this social model of disability was found to be little bit inadequate, because the social model of disability, again, it was trying to look at the role of the society, and it was trying to the critics of the social model of disability, they were critiquing the social biases, the institutional biases that they had been still having towards the disabled individuals. Still, so the critics of the social model of disability were of the argument that as this model is inadequate, so we need to extend the field. We need to make it more inclusive. We need to make it more accommodative. And as I have already mentioned, the cultural model of disability was basically a contribution of the United States of America, and in this particular kind of model, as I have already mentioned, that the deficiency or the kind of lack of ability, the lack of ability or the lack of potential, many of these ideas, they were done away with. And let me put it this way, that and this cultural model of disability in the US, it was basically humanistic in nature. And as I was trying to share my ideas, that the cultural model of disability was basically relying on many of the ideas, many of the concepts of humanities. And as you all know, that US disability right movements had been influenced by the civil rights movement. And as we all know, that in civil rights movement, the role of the philosophers, the role of the poets, the role of the singers were of paramount importance. Similarly, disability right activists in US, they had got their inspiration from the songs, from the poems, from the jazz music. So this is what is something very, very important. The sociological model, they never took into consideration all those cultural expressions. Okay, it can be poetry, it can be song, it can be painting, it can be music. So gradually this paved the way for the cultural model of disability. And as you all know, that in this as I have already mentioned, that the movements which had taken place in the 1960s, 1970s, the emergence of the emancipation movements for people with disabilities, they had paved the way for these things. And in this context, I also kind of make a mention that because of the disability movements, as I have already mentioned, that disability scholarship and disability activism, they are kind of welded into the single whole. We cannot understand the disability literary studies without a proper understanding of the models that I'm mentioning here, and the rights movements. So because of the disability right movements, also in the year 1975, UK had created an organization called Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. This is called UPIS. That this had happened, and Michael Oliver, Victor Frankenstein, Arwin Jola, Colin Barnes, these are the people who had been spearheading this particular kind of movement. And in the UK and in the US also, we have probably in the 1990s, there was this American Disability Act, which was one of the most landmark legislations in the history of US, which had paved the way for kind of promulgation of many of the rules, regulations, which basically address the questions of the people with disabilities. So now let us move on. Now when we talk about this cultural model of disability, we have to keep it in mind that the individual, or the text, I must say, which had played a pivotal role in kind of forging this cultural model of disability was David Mitchell or Sharon Schinder, and they had produced a book called Narrative Prosthesis, Disability and Dependencies Discourse. I'm repeating it again. So the book named Narrative Prosthesis, Disability and the Dependencies of Discourse by David Mitchell and Sharon Schinder, published in 2000, it is considered to be a landmark text as far as disability literary studies are concerned. Now, when we think of probably from the 1990s, this cultural model of disability has made its intervention, and the disability literary studies and cultural studies became a part of the critical disability studies. And now what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to talk about the intervention of literatures into the field of disabilities. Now I would like to focus on this way, that disability, as I have already mentioned, that depiction of disabled characters and disability themes have been very much a part of the literary tradition, both in South Asia and elsewhere. Now, depiction of disability characters and the themes, they have occurred across time and space, from Homer's Oedipus, Shakespeare's Richard III, Melville's Moby Dick, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and of course in the contemporary time, although we have many more texts in the Western canon also. Similarly, when we think of Indian context also, we have the early evidences of the disability characters in the form of, like, Ashtavakra Muni was a disabled individual in the classical Indian context. In the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, we have also disabled characters. In Ramayana, we have Manthara. In Mahabharata, we have Dhritarashtra, King Dhritarashtra. We have also Shakuni. So what I'm trying to talk about here is that the depiction or the or the portrayal. I'm not using the term. I'm not using the term representation deliberately. So what I'm trying to talk about, so the depiction or portrayal of disabled characters and disability themes across literary canon, across time, have been there. Now, question is that when we, let me kind of provide this example. When we look at Shakespeare's King Lear, or Shakespeare's Richard III, or maybe or maybe Melville's Moby Dick. When we look at these particular kind of texts, we can say that these are the early evidences of disability representation in canonical literatures. But one interesting thing is that after the publication of two more important texts, including this narrative prosthesis, two more important names I must mention. That is one is of course narrative prosthesis. Yes, one is called Leonard J. Davis's textbook called Enforcing Normalcy, and Rosemary Garland Thompson's book Extraordinary Bodies. So these are the two important texts which created, I must say, which created a kind of radical change in the way disability has been conceived of in the tradition. As I've already mentioned that Mitchell's and Sinder's book on disability, narrative prosthesis, kind of radically alter the ways in which disability has been conceived in a very traditional way. Disability has been misconstrued, misunderstood as a kind of aberration, as a kind of deviation. And so it has always been perpetuating, disability studies has always been perpetuating the idea of the norm or the normalcy. So as far as disability studies are concerned, as I have already mentioned, that there have been binary oppositions between the normalcy and the lack of normalcy, the able-bodied and the disabled-bodied. This kind of binary oppositions have always been there. So critical disability studies, or maybe the literary disability studies, which is of critical in nature, which is analytical in framework, they basically try to, I must say, deconstruct, like the post-colonial, like the post-colonial literary discourse. It tries to address many of the problems, many of the, kind of accepted biases and stereotypes which have been perpetuated in a misunderstood way. So critical disability studies is basically a kind of intervention which not only paves the way for looking at disability studies from an inclusive point of view, from a transcultural point of view, from a intersectional point of view, but at the same time it tries to kind of question many of the ideas, many of the the representation of the depiction of disability characters and themes as has been presented in the traditional forms of literatures. So that is why I must say critical disability studies basically is a recuperative process. Okay, it is basically a recuperative process from what has been lost, from what has been misunderstood, and it tries to give new directions towards disability studies. Now, as we do not have much time, so what I'm going to do here is that, as I have already mentioned, so after the intervention of critical disability studies or studies, we had started looking at disability studies, or I must say literature's engagement with disability became intersectional. That means disability became associated with sociology, it became associated with politics, it became associated with gender, it became associated with caste in Indian context. So disability, though disability is itself a identity based kind of discourse, it also kind of problematizes the other identity based discourses which are already in operation, like race, class, caste, gender. So basically disability discourse is also not only problematizing, but it is also trying to kind of pave the way for a holistic understanding of disability discourses. Now let me kind of what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to look at some of the representative texts that we all have in the Indian context also. Now let me take examples from the Indian context, and then I would like to discuss some of the texts, because how disability figures out, how disability figures out in the contemporary text, not just as a, Mitchell and Cinder, actually, this is something important, that Mitchell and Cinder was of the opinion that disability has been used as a crutch. Okay, disability has been used as a kind of crutch, against which we have been able to, kind of look at the disabilities. And I just, kind of quote Mitchell and Cinder that, in the traditional canon or in the traditional canonical literature, disability has been seen as a mere crutch upon which literary narratives lean for their representational power, disruptive potentiality, and analytical insight, unquote. So that means literary studies till 19th century, they have been using disability as a kind of prop, as a kind of means for representing something else. But the holistic representation of disability, because that is the cultural model of disability. Cultural model of disability basically try to look at disability from the perspective of phenomenology. That means the subjective experiences. So we are looking at not only the idea of disabled individual, we are looking at the idea of disability. Disability, we all know, this is not a biological idea, this is a social and the cultural construct. So that means disability is a all pervasive kind of experience, and it is related to society, it is related to exclusion, it is related to poverty, it is related to gender, because and also it is related to the racial categories, ethnic categories. So the disabled individuals can have multiple identities. He or she can be he or she can be black, he or she can be a Dalit, he or she can be a Brahmin, he or she can be a Muslim. So cutting across these identity markers. So what I'm trying to talk about here is that, so disability studies basically provides us an opportunity to look at it from multiple frames, perspective of religion, from the perspective of caste, from the perspective of race, from the perspective of ethnicity, and now we are also trying to look at disability studies from the global south. Okay, so now I'd like to share with you a couple of texts also. As you all know, in the Indian context, we have had a number of texts. Basically, I would like to focus on that. One of the pre-independent texts that we all have, probably Subodh Ghosh, probably from Calcutta University, who had kind of published a kind of text. It was a kind of semi-autobiography, and the text is available. You may go for reading this particular kind of text. And the two more texts that I would like to mention here is like Premchand's Rangbhumi. Premchand's Rangbhumi, which was published in 1924. And then there is another important text called in Udia called Kana Mamu. Actually, I'm getting all these ideas from a paper written by Professor Anija. So here they have talked about Rangbhumi in Hindi, Kana Mamu in Udia, and also in Bengali we have Kaka Babu. We all know, written by Sunil Gangopadhyay, and then Tagore's Subha, and there have been many more texts, and I would like to just make a mention of them. Say for example, like we have Maila Achal 1954 by Phanishwar Nath Renu. Then we have also texts in different kind of languages like Dharambir Bharati's Gulki Bano in 1969. We have a text in Tamil, The Blind Girl 1963 by Pichai Murthy. We have also a text called The Lame Child by Tamil writer Chellappa. And and in the contemporary time also, I must mention that like other kind of discourses like Dalit discourses, Afro-American discourses, we have also had a substantial number of autobiographies and memoirs. Malini Chib and many more, and they are all writing in English. And so what I'm going to kind of draw your attention to is the fact that because of the paucity of time, I'm not in a position to talk about them, but I would like to kind of place it in front of you that a vast body of writings in the form of memoirs, in the form of autobiographies, in the form of plays are coming up in a big way. And all these literary texts, and of course many of the non-fictional texts also, they are, I must say, they are subversive in nature. So I'll conclude by talking about that disability literary text is not like a traditional literary canon. These are my kind of conclusions. Number one, disability literary text must be examined from a intersectional and polyphonic perspective, because as I have already mentioned, it engages with the question of gender, engages with the question of race, class, caste, ethnicity, everything. Disability text also can be examined, both fictional and non-fictional, as a kind of, I must say, from the perspective of palimpsest. Disability text is a kind of cultural archive. So our reading of a disability text, okay, our idea of the reading of the disability text must be mediated by your acquaintance with all the cultural culture and identity based markers. Otherwise our understanding of reading interpretation will be a baffling kind of experience. And again, I must say that disability text is very much revisionist in nature, subversive in nature. Okay, so like a Afro-American text, like a Dalit text. So reading of disability text needs altogether a different kind of strategy. And of course, and also I'll conclude with one or two sentences that in the contemporary time, we have many disability movies in the Bollywood. We have, Tare Zameen Par, we have Haidar, we have Khamoshi, we have Pa, we have Hichki, and I'm sure that the audiences who are here, they have all, watched those movies, and I must, kind of ask them to, kind of kind of analyze these kind of films from through the lenses of disability perspective. Again, I am telling you that the representation of disability, or the underrepresentation of disability, or misrepresentation of disability, it has been there. That it is not that the texts or the films produced in the early part of this kind of 20th century, they were all, as I already mentioned, stereotypical in nature. They were all trying to talk about the biases. But after the critical disability studies came into operation, our intervention into it became changed. It became political. And I must conclude by saying that personal became political. A disability text is not just a individual writing. So the individual consciousness and the collective consciousness become one with a disability discourse. And there are many more things to be said. I'm sorry that I could not, maybe it can be like a, kind of, my presentation can be also like a, very partial and, kind of one-sided, but I will ask the people, and again, if you need any kind of help, materials and I'll be very happy to do that. And with this note, let me call it a day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for your enlightening deliberations. And we are really fortunate to have you with us. And we'll take up a number of questions. And a number of questions we have already received. The first question is raised by Sushmita Panda. And sir, can we relate transgender studies with cultural disability?
See, transgender with cultural disability. Okay. See, now, as I have already mentioned that after the kind of arrival of, or the rise of these critical disability studies, we are kind of we are engaging with not only one particular discipline, but with multiple disciplines. Now, the answer can be yes, if I look at it in the broader sense of the term, or the extended sense of the term, because somebody who is suffering from schizophrenia, this is something interesting. Somebody from medical humanities can call that, okay, this is the discipline which belongs to us. But on the other hand, if we can take into consideration the mental disability, as you all know, then critical disability studies also can claim it as part of their discourse also. So transgender, but again, the answer can be no, because in what way transgender is coming under the category of disability? Yes, or if we think of the idea of marginality, if we think of the idea of subalternity, okay, or maybe some of the other discourses, like when we are trying to look at it from the perspective of ableism versus unableism, and then I think yes, or we can consider it to be a part of it. But on critical scrutiny, it can belong to a different kind of yes, cultural discourse. I can talk about it's a cultural discourse, but whether it can be exactly called a disability discourse in the strict sense of the term, very difficult to say.
Sir, another question is raised by Kanijehra Rajavi. Could we now list how positive films have helped more people see disability in a better or more accepting way?
Absolutely, I fully agree with, because as I have already told you that in many of I was reading an article a couple of days before, that many of the traditional Hindi movies or Bengali movies, if you look at it, disabled characters, they are always considered to be kind of discriminated against. Okay, they are always reduced to an object, and the stigmatization, rationalization, and this peripheralization have always taken place as far as disabled characters are concerned. But as I have already mentioned, disability in the US perspective cultural model, they are never considered to be a lack of empowerment. Disability is a kind of empowerment. And as you all know that, yes, positive films, let me share one information. After Tare Zameen Par was, it was, screened, I got the information that, there is a child with dyslexia, no? And CBSE immediately, Central Board of Secondary Education, after the screen was filmed, a movie was screened, they immediately, kind of extended time for the, visually challenged students in their own curriculum. So what can be, so there have been many more. And also there is one film also I had heard that after the publication of the film, people started organizing many kind of programs, charity shows for providing help to the kind of people. I'm sure that many of the positive films on disability are also being kind of produced now, and there has to be many more in order to create. That is what I'm trying to talk about it. I can consider all of these enterprises as part of cultural disability studies, because the purpose is to kind of deconstruct our idea of misunderstanding the way disability studies or disabled characters or disability has been misconstrued, misunderstood in the accepted sense of the term. Disability studies, critical disability studies is basically a fitting post-colonial response, will be providing a post-colonial response to all those quote unquote the lacuna or the crisis.
Yes, sir. And next question is raised by Netra Mukherjee. She raises the issue that is there any existent research work on how visually impaired individuals from academia encounter with and interpret visual texts like movies and theater, since only audio texts and narrated descriptions cannot completely represent a visual text.
Okay, so is there any existing research on that?
Is there any existent research work on how visually impaired individuals from academia?
Yes, I must say that, as I already mentioned, that disability studies being an interdisciplinary field of studies, it is also taken up by departments of sociology. Okay, they are also doing works like a field study, empirical study. Again, the medical sciences also, they are also taking it up in their own way. As far as my knowledge goes, I must admit that I am not familiar with whether there exists this kind of thing, because had it been literatures, I would have answered it in a affirmative way. But definitely, I have to kind of talk to people whether such kind of existing research is available. I'm sure that there might be, and there should be also. It's a good question.
Thank you, sir. Next question is raised by Akash Kumar. It is not sad that most of the mythical cultural representation of disability linked it with wickedness.
That is true. That is what I was trying to draw your attention to, because that was the kind of charity kind of model. Because traditionally disabled characters, not only in kind of Indian context, but in all texts of antiquity, disabled characters have been put in a very poor light, as I have already mentioned, because it was a religious interpretation of the disability and the disabled characters. Because we all believed in the religious scriptures that being born as a disabled is a kind of curse, is a kind of sin. And it was interpreted that way, that it's a kind of punishment. Okay, being born as a disabled is a kind of punishment. And this particular birth, as I have already mentioned, that God has given birth to a disabled individual in order to give him punishment, in order to kind of, what should I say, in order to redeem the sins or the misdeeds that somebody had already committed. So I must not blame it, but I must say that kind of, this is the representation. This is what I am just trying to talk about it. Representation, misrepresentation, or underrepresentation, and that is how we are all getting it. This kind of models. So the charity model, it paved the way, and I'm sure that cultural model of disability also will pave a way, something new, maybe inclusive kind of model, or maybe something different. And this is how we are moving from one knowledge paradigm to another knowledge paradigm. Yes, it's a good question, and it's true. Yeah. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir.
Okay, but I am not able to listen to the question, the last question.
Dr. Shubhankar sir, can you repeat the question, please? So the next question is that he's disconnected. So next question asked by Sandeep Paul, and question is that is it possible to represent disability by the non-disabled writers?
Yes, there have been, yes, there have been this kind of debate, whether, like the Dalit and non-Dalit discourses, that whether the, experiential, the lived experiences of the, I always agree with the fact that, yes, if you, yeah, I mean, I personally believe that the experiences of the disabled characters can be, kind of recounted by them, can be expressed by them in their own languages, which have been happening. But at the same time, the lived experiences of the disabled characters, disability themes, okay, can be done by the non-disabled characters. And I can cite a lot of examples from the Dalit discourse also. Mahasweta Devi's representation of the tribal characters and many more can be cited as examples. And yes, I'm so let the disabled individuals, okay, let them write their, autobiographies, let them write their memoirs. But at the same time, other people who have had experience, okay, experience with disabled people, either directly or indirectly, they can also, because as I already mentioned, that disability is a kind of, subject which involves everybody. When we have a, when we have a disabled individual in our family, okay, when we have a visually challenged individual in our family, he is not only inflicted, all the people who are surrounding him, we all are also, kind of being impacted by his or her presence. So I must say, it's like passively or indirectly, we are all involved with the crises, the challenges, the problems. So why can't we, we, in the sense that the non-disabled people have the right to, so I don't believe in this exclusionary policy. I always believe in inclusiveness. Yes.
One last question, sir, and then the session will be over. This session will be over. This is asked by SD Chakraborty. Sir, the question is that, sir, is there any difference in the representation or even misrepresentation of disability in the Indian text from the text or in Western? So, maybe.
Could you please repeat the question?
Okay. Is there any difference in the representation or even misrepresentation of disability in Indian text from the text in the West?
See, representation or misrepresentation, if I talk about initially the misrepresentation, text still Flaubert's, I think there have been many texts like Flaubert and Melville and many other texts, in the Western canon. There have been, misrepresentation or underrepresentations of the disabled character. And I must say, disabled characters have been used as a kind of trope, because if you look at Shakespeare's Richard III, the villainy, the treacherous character of Richard III is attributed partially to his being disabled. Okay, but this is not true. I'm just giving an example. So, and also if we look at many of the Indian texts also, there have been, misrepresentations of, kind of disabled characters. But again, there have been representation. For example, Premchand's Rangbhumi, where the central character is Surdas, who is a Dalit, who is a, kind of visually challenged. In the first part of the play, in the first part of the text, he is presented as being hapless, as being dependent, as being poor. But the, the subsequent part of the text basically portrays Surdas as a kind of rebel, as a kind of character who, in spite of his disability, who in spite of his, kind of poor caste, tries to challenge the accepted, rules of the society. His subversive nature, his, I must say that determined nature, kind of makes us convinced of his fight against all sorts of, discriminations, social, cultural, political. And so I must say that both the representation and the misrepresentations have always been there, and it is up to the reader, to examine them in the right kind of context. And the same can be applicable in terms of films also, Bollywood films. Many of the early Bollywood films, where disabled characters have been, portrayed in a very poor light, I must say misrepresentation. But in the contemporary context, like Tare Zameen Par, I have already given you example, many of the, kind of positive qualities, many of the positive virtues. So disability is not, I must say, the disability is not lack of efficiency. Disability is not a lack of ability. Disability is not, a kind of defiance. Okay, it is a kind of empowerment. It is a kind of, intervention which can provide, better, I must say, better kind of, ideas to look at it from the positive perspective.
Sorry for the disruptions of the internet.
No,
Sir, we are actually naive of the discourse of disability. So I have certain clarifications from you, if you kindly.
Sure.
Actually, considering the Eurocentric universalism that was evident in different discourses, do you think that the entire discourse of disability is import in origin, or it has been indigenized in Indian context? This is the first question. This is the first. I need to clarify my negotiations with disability. And
sorry to interrupt, Dr. Shubhankar, in between. We will send your question directly to Professor Jana, because our next guest speaker is waiting.
Okay.
And sorry for the interruption in between, because we are facing certain internet connectivity issue. So bear with us, please. And Professor Dr. Ujjwal Jana, thank you so much. Thank you so much, because it was wonderful session. And definitely the questions of Dr. it definitely to you through mail, and hope that we will meet you again. Maybe it is on virtual platform or physically in our campus. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I thoroughly enjoyed my lecture. And sorry for the technical inconvenience which I had in the beginning. And I will be complimenting all my kind of audiences, because for putting the right kind of question. This is the spirit. I like it so much. So I must compliment all the kind of audiences who are on the other side. And I thank each one of you for your interest, for putting these right kind of questions. And again, the department and Indrani ma'am for all the initiative of organizing these things. And thank you so much. And
thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now we have with us an eminent speaker, Professor Shubha Ranganathan, who will enlighten us with her topic, Disability and Mental Health, Critical Perspectives. I, Dr. Shubhankar Roy, welcome you, madam, on behalf of the Amity School of Languages, and may I have the honor to introduce you to the audience. Shubha Ranganathan is Associate Professor in the Department of Liberal Arts, Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. Her background is eclectic and interdisciplinary, having been trained in psychology, but drawing on ethnographic approaches to questions around health, gender, and disability. Her research draws on a range of disciplines such as anthropology, gender studies, disability studies, and alternate paradigms within psychology, such as critical and qualitative psychology. She has been engaged in qualitative explorations of local practices of healing among marginalized groups, as well as health and disability related projects in India. Her work is framed by critical and social justice perspectives, focusing on lived experiences and the role of advocacy for social change. Currently, she is exploring questions about parenting and care in the context of autism as part of her engagement with the neurodiversity discourse in India. So I welcome you, madam, and you please, the platform is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Roy. And I'd like to start off at the outset by thanking the organizers of this faculty development program for inviting me to give a talk as one of the sessions. It is really a pleasure to be here. So, thank you for that opportunity. So I'm going to, make a brief presentation, and I hope to sort of, wind up within time so that we have a little bit of, time for discussion. So what I'm going to do now is to share my screen, and I'm a bit new to the Zoom interface because we typically use Google Meet, but please bear with me. I hope my screen is visible. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Right. So, so what I'm going to talk about, today is some ideas for how we can think about both disability and mental health, together and in relation to each other. And I'm just going to, we have just about 45 to 60 minutes. So I'm just going to share some thoughts about how we can, look at both of these. At the outset, I should state that, I am not someone from a literature background, but I have been, exploring different kinds of writing related to disability, including, fictionalized kinds of works. So I'll try to, bring in some of that, as well as, some thoughts about interesting kinds of work that has been done in art, culture, literature, and so on. But my own background, as Dr. Roy pointed out, is actually very interdisciplinary. I'm someone who has been trained in psychology, clinical psychology in particular, but with my doctoral research, I have moved beyond that. And typically now I engage in qualitative research, drawing from also anthropology, medical humanities, disability studies, gender studies, development studies, right? So in many ways, my work is extremely interdisciplinary. But in that context, what really helps is the kinds of broader, theoretical frameworks or paradigms through which I am actually approaching the topic. So I have done research both in mental health as well as in gender as well as in disability. And what really undercuts a lot of that work is the critical, perspectives. So this is the outline of my presentation. I'll say a little bit about, the theoretical frames of the work, and then talk about what is even the, the debate around the definitions of, disability. And then what I want to do is also give some examples of work which has been done from critical perspectives, both in disability and mental health. Right? So I've already spoken about my, interdisciplinary background. So when, combining both, questions of disability as well as mental health, what I have found extremely useful is to draw from the theoretical frames of critical psychology and critical disability studies. So I'll say a little bit about each of these. So critical psychology is, there are a number of, books which have been written on critical psychology. There's a lot of literature, but essentially what a lot of these scholars talk about is that their interest is to, question some of the fundamental, assumptions, beliefs, and objectives and practices of what they refer to as mainstream psychology, right? So some of you might be familiar that, when one speaks about, psychology, there is often the imagination of a very expert-oriented kind of, domain, right? And much of the, the conventional research in psychology has occurred in artificial kinds of context. It has occurred in laboratory context. It has been done on populations that are more easily available, for instance, student groups. And often it has been characterized by extremely medicalized kind of, approaches. And this is where, the critical psychologists are rather uncomfortable. So in critical psychology, the focus is on fundamentally examining phenomena from the perspective of participants themselves, right? And so one of the the questions which came up in the earlier session that I was just listening to was about who can really speak for disabled persons. Is it only persons with disabilities, or can it be others as well? And of course, we are familiar with this concept in disability studies, that nothing about us without us, right? So in critical psychology also similarly, there is a focus on using methodologies, using approaches which give emphasis to the lived experiences of participants themselves. Secondly, there's also a focus on how the understandings, the knowledge, and the findings in psychology should be used for the benefit of oppressed and marginalized groups. So a fundamental value in social justice is something which is at the foundation of critical psychology. And I have found that this is a useful sort of anchor to ground oneself in, right? So essentially what you have in critical psychology is a more contextualized psychology, where one is looking at experiences not just as stemming from individual psychology or individual psyche or mentality, but looking at them in relation to other social indicators, whether it is caste, class, gender, sexuality, disability, and so on and so forth. Right, so a more grounded, contextualized kind of psychology is the aspiration, as well as a psychology which would be used for social change and social justice, and one that would be more socially relevant. So that's just a broad background as to how we may understand critical psychology, and perhaps draw on that as a useful frame. Now, coming to then disability studies. What is a useful, again, a bunch of scholarship to engage with here is critical disability studies. And I believe that this audience might be familiar with the, the fundamental tenets and principles of critical disability studies. But I just want to point to two important readings, which I think are really useful in terms of grounding one's work. Right, and these are two articles which are landmark, I would say, texts in this field. One is by Simi Linton called Disability Studies, Not Disability Studies, and the second is by Rosemary Garland Thompson. So I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about this. So Simi Linton wrote this piece to sort of differentiate between what she refers to as critical studies and what she refers to as disability studies and not disability studies, right? And if we read that article, we will understand that when she talks about disability studies there, it is actually a reference to what today would be referred to as critical disability studies. But this article really stems from the observation that there is a lot of research which does take place on topics related to disability, or on questions relating to disability, or on disabled populations, but it is not necessarily from a critical perspective, right? And so she felt it is important to sort of mark out that these studies, they might be studying the phenomenon of disability, they might be studying the topic, but they are not from a critical perspective. And so therefore, they should not be actually categorized as disability studies scholarship. So she would place them in the category of not disability studies. So then what is disability studies, really, right? Because she says a lot of that research comes from a very interventionist approach. It comes from from the intention of somehow fixing disability or eliminating that disability, right? But not from a perspective of validating or appreciating disability as an important alternative point of view, right? So what is this category of not disability studies, scholarship or research? I mean, these studies, I mean, whether they are studies or whether they are projects or whether they are, interventions, what they do is they tend to individualize disability, which means locating that disability within the sort of body mind of, the individual. So making a disability as a problem of a particular, disabled individual, something to be fixed, and not giving importance to the voice and agency of disabled persons. So quite often, I mean, these might include, medicalized ways of, let's say, dealing with disability. So I'll just give you an example. For instance, over the last, 2-3 years, I have been engaging in research on the autism spectrum. And in one of these projects, what we have been doing is we have been, doing interviews with parents of autistic persons on their experiences with using a variety of different kinds of therapies, right? So you might be familiar that, when it comes to autism, we have a range, it is referred to as a spectrum, precisely because, there is a wide range of different kinds of, support needs or different kinds of challenges that, individuals face, right? And autism has been one kind of, phenomenon that for which, from time to time, at different points of time, historically, something has often been posited as a kind of miracle cure, or, this is something that will, treat or will, cure autism. And these range from, let's say, your local, treatments or, herbal, remedies, your local religious, practices or healers, to even the more, extremely, scientific kind of, or at least what appear to be as, scientific approaches. So, for instance, what is currently you're receiving a lot of, traction right now in the media is something called stem cell therapy. And particularly in some kinds of, cities like Mumbai, there is a great deal of, publicity given to stem cell therapy as something which has the, the possibility of treating or of curing autism, right? And this therapy is offered by, by hospitals at very high cost, and quite often, because of the kind of lure of, the advertisements, the publicity, the media, families find themselves in positions where, they sign up for these extremely expensive therapies for, their children or their wards, in the hope that they will find something which will cure, autism, right? Now, the fact of the matter is that stem cell therapy is not really a proven scientific kind of, treatment. And especially for autism, it has not really been proved to have beneficial results. In fact, there are certain, quite, dangerous kinds of, side effects which might actually, take place. But the point I'm trying to make is that, all of this is coming from a perspective of trying to fix or eliminate that, that neurodivergence. And it is not coming from what we refer to as a neuroaffirming kind of, perspective, where autism is embraced as a valued aspect of neurodiversity, which is an inherent, aspect in every, in every society and every culture, right? So this would be an example of not disability studies kind of, intervention, right? And there is also a lot of debate and controversy about a variety of other kinds of, therapies also, which, might be offered. So essentially, when looking at whether, a study or an intervention or an approach is coming from a critical perspective or not a critical perspective, the key question is, does it actually value and recognize the perspective of the disabled person? Does it give sufficient, voice to that, right? And does it actually embrace that disability as an important aspect of diversity, right? So if that is not disability studies scholarship, then what do we really refer to as disability studies scholarship? And this is where, Simi Linton actually describes, the critical perspectives in disability studies, where she says that here the focus is on a more contextualized approach, looking at disability in relation to, social, political, cultural factors, in relation to other contextual variables, and not just, the individual's impairment or, quote, lack in some sense. So shifting away from, deficit kind of models to models which actually come from a disability rights perspective, right? And the other important point that she spoke about is about looking at disability also in relation to other intersectionalities, whether these are, caste or class and so on, right? So from this point of view, disability becomes much more of a problem of, society, which has failed to provide sufficient opportunities for the inclusion of persons who are somehow different from others. So I'll give you an example. So for instance, one of my, someone who I know who is a, colleague and a friend and is blind, has spoken about how, he was much more, feels in many ways much more disabled during his interactions and in his life in India, as opposed to, compared to the time when for some time he was living in the UK, right? So, an example that, he would give is that, in the UK, given the fact that, technologies are more inclusive, and given the fact that public spaces are organized in such a way that mobility and navigating the public space is, so much easier as a blind person, he talks about how he does not really feel as disabled, there in that context, right? And so clearly, disability is not something which sort of is, located within an individual or related to an individual's sort of, capacity or lack, but is very much, a structural kind of phenomenon. And looking at shifting the focus to these structures and looking at how these structures and systems can be made more accommodative and inclusive is really what the task of disability studies should be, right? So the second major landmark piece that I want to, draw your attention to is Rosemary Garland Thompson's work. And this article is called Building a World with Disability in It. But there is also a YouTube, lecture. I've given the link here. I'm not sure if we will have the, time to actually, listen to that. But it would be really helpful if you go back and, look at that. Now, in that, Rosemary Garland Thompson again talks about the fact that the aspiration or goal should be to build a world in which disability is an integral part. So she gives several examples and essentially makes the argument that disability is always and has always been an integral part of humanity. It has been an integral part of normal variation in society, and it should not be regarded as something which is separate from or something which is, different. Rather, disability should be embraced or seen as an essential part of basic human variation because it has always existed in society, in humanity, right? And so what are the ways in which we can ensure that a disability is much more visible? So something that Rosemary Garland Thompson says is that we have to learn to see disability. It is there, it has always been there, but in many ways it has been invisibilized. So how can we learn to actually see that, right? And I want to give an example now by playing a short video of a project called the GIMP project. And this is a project which actually combines, disability justice or disability advocacy with art. And I think it would be, useful for this department. So it is called Dancers with Disabilities. And in fact, the project was during the inauguration of that project, which happened in New York a few years ago. Simi Linton had actually given the introduction to that launch. She was invited to do that. Simi Linton herself is also a disabled academic, by the way, and she's also a humanities scholar. As is Rosemary Garland Thompson as well. Both of these are scholars from the humanities. Who are also, disabled and speaking about critical disability studies. So the GIMP project is one which basically seeks to look at what would dance look like if we had, people with disabilities at the forefront of it, and how can we actually reimagine and rethink even things like aesthetics or art or beauty. So I'm going to play this short film. Please let me know if you can actually, can we? I hope the audio and the video are clear.
The video is clear and audio for me it's not.
You are not getting any audio feed?
No.
All right, give me a minute. I think I just need to. Yes, I think it should work now. Please confirm.
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
You want to look, and it's okay. Dancers with Disabilities explore the beauty of imperfection in the performance art piece entitled The GIMP Project. Lawrence Carter Long is a former cerebral palsy poster child who began dancing 2 years ago.
If you have a disability out in the public, people tend to stare, whether you want them to or not.
Right.
But there's an unspoken taboo about it as well.
The piece is being produced by Jeremy Alliger, whose previous credits include a wheelchair dance festival and urban outreach programs.
Well, I've spent much of my producing and presenting career creating projects that challenge people's perceptions of what dance is, what a dancer can look like,
Right.
who can be a dancer. And this project is an outgrowth and continuation of a lot of projects over the years.
GIMP debuts in New York this weekend at the Abram Arts Center. Producers hope to move it to a larger venue in New York.
People with disabilities are allowed to be heroic, and we're allowed to be tragic. Are we allowed to be sexy? I don't know. You don't often see it. I'll be 42 this year. So if you had, told me a little over 2 years ago that I'd be doing this, I would have asked you what you'd been smoking and where I could get some.
Right. So that's about, the GIMP project. And I just want to say that, this is an example from an, international context. We do have, examples from India also. We have the Blind with Camera project, for instance, and Partha Bhaumik has, written about that in an issue of Cafe de Census, which is an alternative magazine, by the way. And we also have, other, similar projects. There is also this interesting film by Anand Gandhi called Ship of Theseus, which is a long film, but, the first story within that actually follows the story of a blind photographer, and what happens when she actually gets a cornea transplant and then gains her, eyesight. What happens to her photography? What happens to her art? What happens to herself? And it's interesting that, the film sort of, twists the narrative by displaying how, she experienced that she was a much more, effective artist or photographer when she was blind, and she actually found that sightedness became something that she had to overcome, as it were. So that's again an interesting, again, film made in the Indian context. Another example that I want to show you is from C.C. Bell's El Defo. C.C. Bell has written this book, which is based on, it is an autobiographical sort of, narrative, which is represented in a graphic format. So it's a graphic book, but it basically, chronicles her own sort of childhood story of growing up as someone who had hearing initially and then lost it. And then she received the sort of, the implant, but she had the sort of, the hearing aid, which, looked very different in its earlier avatar. But she talks about how what happens when you begin to think about your, your disability as a kind of, superpower. And so she has written this graphic book in the superhero kind of, trope. And it's a wonderful book. And it's also very interesting because it is a work which is coming straight from, I'm sorry, straight from a disabled person, herself. So I'm just going to show you the short trailer to that. So this book has also been recently made into a television, series, which is available, I think, on Disney Hotstar. I'm just going to show you that trailer.
Eep. Boop. Hello? Do you think my hearing aids make me look funny?
I don't see a problem.
Are you deaf?
I gotta follow my own path.
You can call me El Defo. Oh no! Prepare for a monstrous makeover, my deaf friend. Stop! Yeehaw!
Cece can hear Mrs. Sinkelman all over the school.
Wow, that's impressive.
Where is Mrs. Sinkelman now?
She just flushed.
Oh my gosh.
Woohoo! Mrs. Sinkelman is coming. Go back to your seats.
That was awesome. You're a hero.
I am El Defo.
So that's the official trailer to the television series, which I'm sure should be available more widely. And I'm just going to the book itself. I mean, a soft copy version of the book is available on LibGen, by the way. I'm going to play a short video of C.C. Bell herself actually talking about this.
Hi, my name is Cece Bell, and the character of El Defo is based on me.
Started out just a dream or a distant memory.
I was born with hearing, and everything was hunky-dory. And then when I was about 4.5, I got very sick with meningitis. I ended up losing about 85 to 90% of my hearing. So my parents decided that the best way forward was to focus on lip reading and for me to get hearing aids.
Never felt like this before.
This is the box that contains my phonic ear, heavier than it looks. A couple of earpieces, on and off switches, the teacher's microphone. The teacher would put it around her neck and wear it all day. I always kept it covered, and I lied about what it was. I was so self-conscious about my hearing loss that I did not want to learn sign language.
Are you deaf, Mimi?
I did not want to draw attention to myself. Being different and feeling different can be really challenging. It can be lonely. And if you're shy, like I was, and not able to talk about it, it's harder to get out of those feelings. About 5 or 6 years ago, I published a graphic novel called El Defo, which is the story of my childhood. That book has been turned into a television show on Apple TV+. I loved the shows about superheroes that came on in the early 70s. They seemed like normal people who were just putting on a costume. They weren't all muscular. It was the equipment that really captivated me, because being able to have all these tools to do superheroic things really reminded me of the phonic ear that I was strapping on every day. And when I thought about the phonic ear as, oh, this is equipment, and it does give me a superpower, and the superpower is super hearing. I really like the idea of turning that into an actual superhero.
You can call me El Defo.
It's just a stronger version of me, but in this case, wearing a cape and wearing an undershirt with a big old hearing aid on top, because that's the equipment. That is my superhero equipment. What's really important about that costume is she is willing to show that phonic ear in real life, and that's what makes her really a superhero. This is my own unique personal story. It's not the story of every deaf person at all.
You decide which way to go, side by side with on heels.
Some people might be like me and wear hearing aids and lip read. Some might prefer sign language. The attitude that I had as a kid is not my attitude at all today. Sign language is an amazing, necessary, vital language, and there's absolutely no right or wrong way for a person with a disability to do their disability. I was a kid with all of the same hopes and dreams and fears and desire for friendship. Every kid has something about them that makes them feel different or self-conscious. You may feel that these differences just will mark you for life. And the truth is, those are the things that will make you so much stronger. Look for the superhero within.
Right. So that's about, Cece Bell's El Defo. And I just want to draw attention to an important point that she mentioned there, which is that, this is very much her own, unique experience, and that also there are multiple ways of, being deaf. there are multiple ways in which, people experience their disability and even understand as to, what is disability, right? So for instance, for some, the use of, lip reading has been helpful. I mean, others would, take to sign language, and that goes for many experiences around both disability as well as psychosocial disability and mental health as well. So for instance, I've been doing research on autism over the last few years, and there is a famous, phrase that we often use in autism, which is that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, right? Just to sort of indicate that there is such a range in terms of even what is understood as, even in terms of understanding whether autism is a kind of, disability, or whether it should be seen more as more in terms of difference and, diversity, right? Even the kinds of, terminologies are, used very differently, right? So that brings me to the next section, which is really on defining disability. And I've sort of, on this slide deliberately put the image of a wheelchair there, because I thought it was interesting when I was, making this PowerPoint presentation, that the moment I sort of, typed defining disability as the heading of this section, the sort of, image which popped up as a, as a suggestion, from Microsoft, as it were, to use, is the image of the wheelchair. So it's interesting, when we think about what are seen as the representations of disability, what are imagined as, images or, terms or, phrases or pictures which come to mind when one thinks of, disability. And clearly, at least, Microsoft is saying that, for them, the sort of stereotypical image which comes up is, the wheelchair, which again is something which only refers to, visible disabilities. But there are a number of, disabilities which are not obvious, which are not visible. One can think of, for instance, psychosocial disabilities. One can think of intellectual and developmental disabilities like learning disabilities and autism and so on, and several other, disabilities as well, which may not be obviously sort of, visible, and yet, they do define how people experience the world, right? So why is disability important? One of the important sort of learnings from critical disability studies scholarship is that disability is important because it is an issue that concerns all of us. And I want to remind you of, something which I mentioned earlier, that today in critical disability scholarship, one doesn't really think of, of disabled persons occupying a separate sort of category, as it were. So this binary between, the non-disabled and the disabled, or this binary between able-bodiedness and, disabled, is not really something which is useful anymore. So for instance, there are some people in critical disability studies scholarship who speak about temporarily, able-bodied or disabled, right? And even the sort of, situations or experiences of non-disabled persons are referred to as, temporarily able-bodied, because of the recognition that all of us in some ways are, likely to be affected by a variety of different situations, such as, for instance, all of us at some point in time might have to deal with aging and the kinds of changes that aging brings about, both in our, bodies and minds, right? And in many ways, those experiences of aging are, or might be seen as a parallel to, experiences around disability. We might be able-bodied at this point of time right now, but, we might encounter some kind of, chronic illness, right? Which renders, the body in some ways makes it difficult to, function in what is understood as a, quote unquote, normal manner, right? So this sort of stark difference or binary between, normal and disabled, or able-bodied and disabled is not something that is, valid anymore. And instead, one can think about disability and mental health as such as lying on a continuum, as it were, rather than as occupying, two separate sort of spaces. So disability is something which is everywhere, right? As Simi Linton said, and as Rosemary Garland Thompson said, the real challenge is to learn to look for it and to make it more visible, right? And fixing the category of disability is not really what is important. When we think about, defining disability, or even understanding what is, what does it mean to, to be disabled in a particular way, it's not important in terms of, defining it, but rather using disability as a kind of lens through which we think of, things like inclusion, accommodation, and discrimination is something which is important. And if you think about it, the kinds of practices which are used, or the kinds of, strategies and technologies which are used for inclusion and accommodation are actually relevant for all persons, whether disabled or not. I mean, for instance, all of us, for instance, have come to rely on closed captions when we are watching, videos, and it doesn't matter whether, you are disabled or not. It is helpful in terms of, following accents. It is really helpful for people, who have grown up in particular kinds of, environments, right? So that is an example of an accommodation, which is something which is useful, for all persons. And I mean, there are so many examples. Even if we think of, for instance, the ramp, which is present, in public spaces, is not something that is used only or exclusively by disabled persons. It is also used by aged persons on a wheelchair. It is used by young, healthy individuals who are pushing a shopping trolley or pushing a baby stroller. And so clearly, this is something which needs to be, seen as, accessibility is a requirement for all persons, not only, disabled persons. As a famous scholar Sutherland said, we have to recognize that disablement is not merely the physical state of a small minority of people. It is a normal condition of, humanity. And in fact, Susan Wendell, she has an article where she talks about, this overlaps between both chronic illness and disability. And she uses this phrase called the healthy disabled, wherein, you can have, just as you can have, people with, people with chronic illness who don't necessarily have a disability as such, but who are in some way sort of, incapacitated. Similarly, you can also have, disabled persons who are, actually more healthy, really, right? So these are basically, categories which are fluid and which should be seen more as a continuum rather than as a discrete category. I just want to point to, the rich volume of literature which is available also in graphic formats in this entire field that is, referred to as graphic medicine in the medical humanities. So there are a number of, works, some of which have been written by people who have themselves, had experiences around chronic illness, mental health, and disability. So for instance, this book Cancer Vixen by Marisa Acocella Marchetto, chronicling, her own experience in grappling, with cancer. And these are, just some of the examples of ways of, making one's scholarship and one's academic work more accessible to a wider audience. And you have also a rich volume of literature on disability themes, which is written for a younger audience, children and, teens. You have a number of, works which are talking about different kinds of disabilities, including intellectual disabilities, including mental health, again, written in more written in more accessible language. I mean, what is referred to as plain language in disability, right? And also written in a more engaging manner. So I want to now, I've been giving you some examples of, critical work in disability studies scholarship, which has come from the, the voices of disabled persons themselves. I want to now talk a little bit about critical work which has been done in mental health, again, from a critical perspective. And mental health is often seen as this extremely specialized kind of, domain, right? I mean, it is seen as something which requires a particular kind of, expertise. And often there is, it tends to be a field which is overly medicalized and overly psychiatrized. But there are perspectives beyond mainstream psychology or beyond mainstream psychiatry, which are also relevant. And in fact, disability studies perspectives have also been useful in making sense of experiences around mental diversity or mental health. And one example that I want to talk about is this book by Karen Nakamura. She is an anthropologist in the US who has written this book called as Disability of the Soul. And it follows the experiences of a community of persons who are residing in, they are residing in a home in Japan, right? And this is a, community living sort of, facility for people with serious psychiatric disabilities. So many of them have very obvious and psychiatric disabilities. They have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. They have experiences like, seeing and hearing things which are, not there, challenging interpersonal issues, right? And she has done an ethnographic study of that community, which is called Bethel, right? And it's a fascinating work because it brings together, disability, mental health, and in some ways also, learnings from queer studies as well, right? But she talks about what would, serious mental distress or mental illness look like from the perspective of the disabled person herself, right? And this is also something which has been made into a film, which you can watch later. I'm not going to play it now because it is over 30 minutes or so. So we will not have time for that. But I've shared the link here. This is the link to the film that is available for watching, and it's very interesting because it gives an example of how one can look at experiences of mental illness also from a perspective that actually validates it. So, for instance, one of the examples one can talk about is, this phenomenon of, hearing voices or, what is called, in technical language, hallucinations, right? Now, in conventional mainstream, clinical psychology or psychiatry, a hallucination where a person hears or sees something which is not there, right, is actually seen as one of the cardinal signs of a serious psychiatric disorder, in most cases schizophrenia. It is seen as a clear-cut indication that a person has lost touch with reality, that they are not in their senses, so to speak, and they are sort of, require serious mental health care, right? But there are alternative perspectives which are actually, talking about the fact that voice hearing, hearing voices which, other persons do not, is actually far widespread than, I'm sorry, than we sort of, acknowledge. And in fact, in a variety of, contexts, people, even, so-called normal individuals or, healthy persons do hear voices of others. One example, sorry, please give me a minute, bear with me. So one of the examples of, of how widespread hallucinations is if you have lost, a loved one, a loved person, if someone has died, someone who is close to you, then it is quite common to find that, sometime after that has occurred, people will sort of, hear that person talking to them, or they will hear that the voice of that person, and this is something which is far more common. So basically, the sort of in a lot of the critical neuroscience literature, what they're saying is that hallucinations are actually not necessarily abnormality. They are not necessarily a sign of abnormality or illness as such. And therefore, a simple anti-psychiatry position is not necessarily something which is, useful. And I'm going to give you an example now by playing a small, TED TED talk by Eleanor Longden, who talks about her experiences with hearing voices. Now, Eleanor Longden is someone who is, she is actually, has become quite famous as as a user survivor of mental health, right? And she talks about her experiences with being diagnosed, with mental illness because she was, hearing voices, but how she actually then came to look at her voice hearing as something, came to validate that experience and look at it as part of her subjectivity. And today Eleanor Longden has become quite a celebrity in some sense when it comes to speaking about mental health advocacy. So I'm just going to play that short talk.
The day I left home for the first time to go to university was a bright day, brimming with hope and optimism. I'd done well at school, expectations for me were high, and I gleefully entered the student life of lectures, parties, and traffic cone theft. Now, appearances, of course, can be deceptive, and to an extent, this feisty, energetic persona of lecture-going and traffic cone stealing was a veneer, albeit a very well-crafted and convincing one. Underneath, I was actually deeply unhappy, insecure, and fundamentally frightened. Frightened of other people, of the future, of failure, and of the emptiness that I felt was within me. But I was skilled at hiding it, and from the outside, appeared to be someone with everything to hope for and aspire to. This fantasy of invulnerability was so complete that I even deceived myself. And as the first semester ended and the second begun, there was no way that anyone could have predicted what was just about to happen. I was leaving a seminar when it started, humming to myself, fumbling with my bag, just as I'd done 100 times before, when suddenly I heard a voice calmly observe, "She is leaving the room." I looked around and there was no one there, but the clarity and decisiveness of the comment was unmistakable. Shaken, I left my books on the stairs and hurried home, and there it was again. "She is opening the door." This was the beginning. The voice had arrived. And the voice persisted. Days and then weeks of it, on, narrating everything I did in the third person. She is going to the library. She is going to a lecture. It was neutral, impassive, and even, after a while, strangely companionate and reassuring. Although I did notice that its calm exterior sometimes slipped, in that it occasionally mirrored my own unexpressed emotion. So, for example, if I was angry and had to hide it, which I often did, being very adept at concealing how I really felt, then the voice would sound frustrated. Otherwise, it was neither sinister nor disturbing, although even at that point, it was clear that it had something to communicate to me about my emotions, particularly emotions which were remote and inaccessible. Now, it was then that I made a fatal mistake in that I told a friend about the voice, and she was horrified. A subtle conditioning process had begun. The implication that normal people don't hear voices, and the fact that I did, meant that something was very seriously wrong. Such fear and mistrust was infectious. Suddenly, the voice didn't seem quite so benign anymore. And when she insisted that I seek medical attention, I duly complied, and which proved to be mistake number 2. I spent some time telling the college GP about what I perceived to be the real problem: anxiety, low self-worth, fears about the future, and was met with bored indifference until I mentioned the voice, upon which he dropped his pen, swung round, and began to question me with a show of real interest. And to be fair, I was desperate for interest and help, and I began to tell him about my strange commentator. And I always wish at this point the voice had said, "She is digging her own grave." I was referred to a psychiatrist who likewise took a grim view of the voice's presence, subsequently interpreting everything I said through a lens of latent insanity. For example, I was part of a student TV station that broadcast news bulletins around the campus, and during an appointment, which was running very late, said, "I'm sorry, doctor, I've got to go, I'm reading the news at 6. Now, it's found in my medical records that Eleanor has delusions that she's a television news broadcaster. It was at this point that events began to rapidly overtake me. A hospital admission followed, the first of many. A diagnosis of schizophrenia came next. And then, worst of all, a toxic, tormenting sense of hopelessness, humiliation, and despair about myself and my prospects. But having been encouraged to see the voice, not as an experience, but as a symptom, my fear and resistance towards it intensified. Now, essentially, this represented taking an aggressive stance towards my own mind, a kind of psychic civil war. And in turn, this caused the number of voices to increase and grow progressively hostile and menacing. Helplessly and hopelessly, I began to retreat into this nightmarish inner world in which the voices were destined to become both my persecutors and my only perceived companions. They told me, for example, that if I proved myself worthy of their help, then they could change my life back to how it had been. And a series of increasingly bizarre tasks was set, a kind of labor of Hercules. It started off quite small, for example, pull out 3 strands of hair, but gradually it grew more extreme, culminating in commands to harm myself and a particularly dramatic instruction. You see that tutor over there? You see that glass of water? We have to go over and pour it over him in front of the other students, which I actually did, and which, needless to say, did not endear me to the faculty. In effect, a vicious cycle of fear, avoidance, mistrust, and misunderstanding had been established. This was a battle in which I felt powerless and incapable of establishing any kind of peace or reconciliation. 2 years later, and the deterioration was dramatic. By now, I had the whole frenzied repertoire: terrifying voices, grotesque visions, bizarre, intractable delusions. My mental health status had been a catalyst for discrimination, verbal abuse, and physical and sexual assault. And I'd been told by my psychiatrist, "Eleanor, you'd be better off with cancer, because cancer is easier to cure than schizophrenia." I'd been diagnosed, drugged, and discarded, and was by now so tormented by the voices that I attempted to drill a hole in my head in order to get them out. Now, looking back on the wreckage and despair of those years, it seems to me now as if someone died in that place, and yet someone else was saved. A broken and haunted person began that journey, but the person who emerged was a survivor and would ultimately grow into the person I was destined to be. Many people have harmed me in my life, and I remember them all, but the memories grow pale and faint in comparison with the people who've helped me. The fellow survivors, the fellow voice hearers, the comrades and collaborators. The mother who never gave up on me, who knew that one day I would come back to her and was willing to wait for me for as long as it took. The doctor who only worked with me for a brief time, but who reinforced his belief that recovery was not only possible, but inevitable. And during a devastating period of relapse, told my terrified family, "Don't give up hope. I believe that Eleanor can get through this. Sometimes, you know, it snows as late as May, but summer always comes eventually." 14 minutes is not enough time to fully credit those good and generous people who fought with me and for me and who waited to welcome me back from that agonized, lonely place. But together, they forged a blend of courage, creativity, integrity, and an unshakable belief that my shattered self could become healed and whole. I used to say that these people saved me, but what I now know is they did something even more important in that they empowered me to save myself. And crucially, they helped me to understand something which I'd always suspected, that my voices were a meaningful response to traumatic life events, particularly childhood events, and as such were not my enemies, but a source of insight into solvable emotional problems. Now, at first, this was very difficult to believe, not least because the voices appeared so hostile and menacing. So in this respect, a vital first step was learning to separate out a metaphorical meaning from what I'd previously interpreted to be a literal truth. So, for example, voices which threatened to attack my home, I learned to interpret as my own sense of fear and insecurity in the world rather than an actual objective danger. Now, at first, I would have believed them. I remember, for example, sitting up one night on guard outside my parents' room to protect them from what I thought was a genuine threat from the voices, because I'd had such a bad problem with self-injury that most of the cutlery in the house had been hidden. So I ended up arming myself with a plastic fork, like picnicware, and sort of sat outside the room clutching it, waiting to spring into action should anything happen. It was like, don't mess with me. Got a plastic fork, don't you know? No, it's strategic. But a later response, and much more useful, would be to try and deconstruct the message behind the words. So when the voices warned me not to leave the house, then I would thank them for drawing my attention to how unsafe I felt, because if I was aware of it, then I could do something positive about it. But go on to reassure both them and myself that we were safe and didn't need to feel frightened anymore. I would set boundaries for the voices and try to interact with them in a way that was assertive yet respectful, establishing a slow process of communication and collaboration in which we could learn to work together and support one another. Throughout all of this, what I would ultimately realize was that each voice was closely related to aspects of myself, and that each of them carried overwhelming emotions that I'd never had an opportunity to process or resolve. Memories of sexual trauma and abuse, of anger, shame, guilt, low self-worth. The voices took the place of this pain and gave words to it. And possibly one of the greatest revelations was when I realized that the most hostile and aggressive voices actually represented the parts of me that had been hurt the most profoundly. And as such, it was these voices that needed to be shown the greatest compassion and care. It was armed with this knowledge that ultimately I would gather together my shattered self, each fragment represented by a different voice, gradually withdraw from all my medication and return to psychiatry. Only this time from the other side. 10 years after the voice first came, I finally graduated, this time with the highest degree in psychology the university had ever given, and 1 year later, the highest master's, which I always say isn't bad for a mad woman. In fact, one of the voices actually dictated the answers during an exam, which technically possibly counts as cheating. And to be honest, sometimes I quite enjoyed their attention as well. As Oscar Wilde said, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. It also makes you very good at eavesdropping because you can listen to two conversations simultaneously, so it's not all bad. I worked in mental health services, I spoke at conferences, I published book chapters and academic articles, and I argued, and continue to do so, the relevance of the following concept, that an important question in psychiatry shouldn't be what's wrong with you, but rather what's happened to you.
Right. So I just pause that because I noticed we might be running out of time, but you can, look it up later as well. So that's an example of, Eleanor Longden's experience with the hearing voices phenomenon, but also the hearing voices network. And, she refers to it, but there are much more details in a book by Lisa Blackman called Hearing Voices. She has done research on the Hearing Voices network. And what the Hearing Voices Network tries to do is come up with a fundamental new way of approaching experiences like hearing voices through, for instance, offering strategies that Eleanor talked about, such as learning to actually interact with your voices, not be afraid of them, collaborate with them, and so on. There's another wonderful memoir which is written by Reshma Valiappan, in the Indian context, called Fallen Standing, where again she talks about her own experiences with being diagnosed with schizophrenia and having a number of things which conventional psychiatry would see as symptoms, but what happens when you look at them also as valid parts of your subjectivity. And there's a wonderful film which has been made by Aparna Sanyal called A Drop of Sunshine, which is about Reshma's experience. But these are some examples of what a critical perspective on mental health would argue that one can look at, experiences of distress or difference or disability as also valid aspects of human subjectivity. So in conclusion, I just want to say that, contemporary approaches to both disability and critical mental health, what they do is they are characterized by a focus on intersectionality, where we look at, contextual factors, we look at the role of multiple social, locations, and we're also seeking to decolonize, scholarship, whether it is critical mental health scholarship or disability studies scholarship. And we're also looking at the concept of normality itself. There's an important statement that, the famous disability studies scholar Leonard Davis says, where he says that, quite often, disability or the study of disability has been approached from it has been understood as, the study of disabled persons. But we also need to return to the concept of, the norm and the normal itself and critiquing that idea of the norm itself, right? So I'm going to stop here, and I'd like to end with a quote from a film, The Reason I, Jump, which is, we can change the conversation by being part of the conversation. This is a wonderful, documentary film based on the famous book by Naoki Higashika, The Reason I Jump, which is, chronicles the experience of a young autistic boy talking about what does autism really, look like from, the perspective of the autistic person herself, right? So I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take on any questions that come up.
So thank you, madam, for your discursive deliberations and how the multifarious implications of disability cutting across ages has given birth to a new poetic medium. And I think that the participants would be greatly enriched, and they would be able to explore the newer areas in their areas of research. And the advancement and importance of the topic is evident by the way that one of our participants has edited, despite being a bipolar, has edited a book, Crossing Over by Gitanjali Mehra. And I would request the participants to raise their questions if they have any. Dr. Prathyush Ranjan Padhi has raised his hand. So I would like to request Dr. Prathyush Ranjan Padhi to put forward his questions to the madam.
Yes, a very good afternoon, Dr. Shubha. It was really a pleasure listening to your indulging lecture on how mental health is being critically examined and in this particular disability studies. So I have few observations, ma'am, regarding this particular context of critical psychology. So in literature also, there were few of the literary writers like Sylvia Plath and if you see Virginia Woolf, who had been not diagnosed exactly as a mad, but they were due to lack of medical science advancement. They were categorized as mad woman, and there are many, so and so on. So literature also deals with this particular thing. Now, my particular observation and regarding this is, ma'am, you see, amnesia or memory loss, can we categorize it as a disability? And if yes, then how does medical science or critical psychology address and deal with this particular issue of memory loss, or in medical science, if you say amnesia, how does critical psychology deal with this particular issue?
Right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those additional references. Yes, I think they are very relevant. Absolutely. Sylvia Plath and Virginia Woolf. sort of known, to have struggled with, mental health concerns. I mean, when it comes to amnesia, so for me, I think what I think is important, as someone who has engaged in the study of difference, in some way or the other in different respects, that what is important is not so much as to would we define a particular thing as disability or not? Would we define a particular condition as a mental condition or not? But on what is the impact that it has on your life? Does it incapacitate you in some way? Does it interfere or disturb one's sort of everyday life or functioning in some way, right? And I think, I mean, in that respect, that is where now we are broadening the idea of looking at mental health, disability, chronic illness from more of an experiential kind of point of view. So definitely, memory loss can actually be fairly serious. It can impact one's everyday life, and in some way it can be in that respect disabling, right? And memory is very much connected with also trauma, right? And I think therefore when we talk about approaches and interventions which are useful nowadays, trauma informed approaches are important, to sort of that is where the role of context becomes important, that to see that memory loss or amnesia not just as a symptom of a brain, right, functioning, but as also related with personal experience, including trauma.
Yes, exactly, ma'am. Thank you so much for your response, and my question is rightly addressed. Thank you, Dr. Shubha.
Thank you, madam. And one of our participants, Anandi Ghosh, has raised the question. Since disability studies talk about inclusion and questioning, what is the norm? Where do you think we are standing with respect to the interface between queer studies and disability studies? Madam, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that point. I mean, I think that, exploring this, intersections between different kinds of, identity positions and locations is extremely important. I mean, disability studies has a lot to draw from queer studies scholarship, feminist scholarship, Dalit scholarship, right? And I think today we are talking about intersectionalities. We are talking about also experiences of multiple sort of identities in relation to each other. So it is important to also, I think, form alliances between different movements or different different advocacy perspectives. I think that is something which is extremely important. And in fact, my own interest in disability studies really came from an observation that conventionally in the mental health discourse, there is an absence of a strong critical voice, whereas in disability studies, approaches and movements, there is a strong rights-based kind of approach. I do think that bringing together both disability studies as well as mental health advocacy, queer studies, scholarship, all of this is extremely important.
Ma'am, can I go ahead and ask my question?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Shubha, for this wonderful instructive session. I really did not know that these are all the elements connected to disability and especially the critical perspectives on mental health. So I will say two things and then I have a question. First of all, thank you very much for sharing LDEFO. Since I'm working with a local NGO, I'll be really, I think everyone will be happy that if we show them this picture, this little documentary. And second, thank you very much for sharing the GIMP project. It is very important since the state where I reside right now, Himachal Pradesh, the government is working towards with NGOs towards people with disabilities. So I think this will be a great addition to inform the people who are in the policy making. And ma'am, my question is that since we are talking about critical perspectives and the multiple ways in which a person might experience disability. So my question is, does any individual needs to be disabled in order to understand the experiences of disabled people in order to write something fruitful and educative in literature or any other domain which might inform people around us?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think this question, I think, did sort of, come up in the, previous session as well, right? And I want to sort of, answer this question by actually, I'm going to just, share my screen for a minute, because I just want to show a quote which I think will be useful, right? And this is from again, if you can see my screen, this is from from Rosemary Garland Thompson's article, sorry. And what she says is that, a question that is often heard in these circles is who should write and teach in this field, whether it is only disabled or non-disabled, persons, right? And the response is that both disabled and non-disabled people can perpetuate or work to ameliorate or reduce the objectification of disabled people, the lack of subjectivity, the absence of voice, the absence of self-definition and self-determination. And she goes on to say, I don't assume that disabled persons are exempt from the tendency to stereotype or objectify, because after all, both of them have been schooled in the same ableist discourse. And so basically the response is that, both disabled and non-disabled persons can actually work from critical, perspectives. And I think this is similar to the kind of response which the previous, speaker had also, made. So I think it's not so much about what kind of, political identity you sort of, occupy, or what in that sense, status, you occupy, but more about what kind of, approaches or frameworks one is coming from. That is something which is important.
Right, ma'am. Thank you very much. Since your response is affirmative, so just a quick response I need for this. Since we have already introduced environmental studies, made it mandatory in most of the curriculums because we really want to understand environment and the importance of it. So should we also start having disability studies as a part of the curriculum so that we also, help normative people to understand fellow human beings better?
Sorry, in what curriculum?
I mean, normal in the school curriculums, ma'am.
In school, yes. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I would think that, it is something which should be, engaged in at all levels. Yeah.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Yes, madam. And another question is raised by Kanizehera Rajavi.
Yeah, I can tell you, I can speak if you don't mind. I want you to also tell us not only the trajectory of illness, mental illness, or even physical disability, but there is a very, very strong trajectory today of healing and going beyond the illnesses. And that has been shown in literature and in our athletes and our Everest achievers. And this is a very important part of inspiration for all our people in our country. Please mention this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, thank you for that point. I mean, I think narratives of healing are definitely, important. And again, narratives of healing are also very diverse. Pathways to healing and recovery are, sorry, are also very different. Sorry. Yeah, so I think we have, we have different pathways to healing and recovery as well. And so therefore, everyone's healing journey is different, right? And recognizing and valuing that multiplicity is also something which is important. So, I mean, and this is something which, the scholarship on critical mental health is also, trying to do. So I don't think we have time now to actually go into more details, but I'd be happy to connect later as well and address your questions in more detail. But I'm afraid we probably have to wind up the session now.
Oh, yes, madam. Madam, this is the last question asked by Shraddha Gidlani. That can disability be related in spiritual context, as it is something that cannot be perceived by other but by the individual only?
So I see disability is discursive. It's not only a material kind of phenomenon, right? It's also about how one speaks about it, how, what kinds of constructions are there, how one represents it, what connotations, it has. And, spirituality can also be a lens for making sense of, phenomena, including making sense of disability as well. So, so it can, be in ways related to, spirituality, but it doesn't have to as well. That would be my response.
Thank you, madam, for your enlightening deliberations. And in the days to come, we hope that we'll be able to listen more of you and would be guided by your sagacious deliberations and enlightening presentations. And my request to all the participants that we have already posted the requisite quizzes, and you are required to submit the quizzes prior to beginning the next session tomorrow. And we would like all the panelists to turn on their cameras so that we can take a click on, turn on their videos so that we can have a click.